In a court ruled by swords, a woman's mind was her most dangerous possession. For daring to be brilliant, the scholar Maeva was publicly shamed. Her life's work was burned to ash, and her voice was condemned to silence. Before the cruel laughter of powerful men, she was sentenced to a life of humiliating servitude, broken and cast aside. She believed her story had come to a bitter end. But she did not count on the one man who watched from the throne, a warrior king who could command armies but could not read a single word. He was about to take the woman they had all tried to silence and make her his only voice. The great hall of King Alaric was a cavern of stone and shadow, built to celebrate power. Sunlight struggled through high, narrow windows, catching on the polished steel of armored guards and the rich tapestries depicting Alaric's bloody victories. It was a hall that understood the language of the sword, of shouted commands and fealty sworn on bended knee. It was not a place for quiet thoughts, and yet, at its center, stood a woman armed with nothing but a stack of parchment and a revolutionary idea. Maeva was not a creature of the court. She wore no fine silks or jewels, only a simple woolen dress the color of moss. Her hair was bound back not for style, but for practicality, keeping it from her eyes as she worked. She seemed small in that vast space, a lone ship in a hostile sea, but her posture held a straight, unyielding dignity. In her eyes there was a light, a fire of fierce intelligence that refused to be extinguished by the sea of indifferent and powerful men who surrounded her. Her voice, when she began, was a soft thing, nearly swallowed by the hall's oppressive silence. But as she unrolled her first scroll, a meticulous chart of the night sky, her words gained strength. She spoke of patterns in the cosmos, of the predictable dance of distant stars, of a universe governed not by chaotic superstition, but by elegant hidden laws. She explained how the star she called the Wanderer would appear in the north during the harvest month, a celestial event that the court-seers had long proclaimed a random and terrible omen. She was predicting the future, not with entrails or chance, but with mathematics. It was a profound and dangerous magic. From his seat beside the throne, Arch-Chancellor Theron watched her, his lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. He was a man draped in velvet and authority, his mind a fortress of established dogma. He saw not a brilliant scholar, but an insect to be crushed. Every word she spoke was an affront, a challenge to the power he held as the sole interpreter of all knowledge, both sacred and profane. He let her speak, giving her enough rope, he thought, to hang herself with. The lords and ladies of the court began to whisper. Her ideas were absurd, they murmured. A woman speaking of the stars as if they were beads on a string. The whispers grew into snickers, a tide of mockery rising around her. Maeva's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on, her voice tightening as she fought to be heard over the growing disrespect. On his throne, King Alaric sat as still as the granite it was carved from. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on Maeva. He did not understand the intricate lines on her charts or the complex numbers she recited. To him, the written word was a treacherous jungle, a place of traps and deceptions where his own father had been lost. He understood the heft of a shield, the arc of a battle-axe, the loyalty of a man who looked him in the eye. He did not understand this, but he understood cruelty. He saw the pack closing in on a lone wolf. He saw Theron's smug satisfaction, the court's casual viciousness, and in Maeva he saw a courage he couldn't name. His hand, resting on the arm of his throne, clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white. But he remained silent. To intervene now would be to admit confusion, to challenge his chancellor on a matter of the mind, exposing his own great secret weakness. And so he watched, a prisoner of his own crown. Finally, Theron raised a hand. The hall fell silent, eager for the kill. "You have entertained us sufficiently, child," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He rose and walked toward her, circling her as a predator would. "You speak of predictable patterns in the heavens, but I see a very predictable pattern right here. a woman overreaching her station, meddling in forces she cannot possibly comprehend, and cloaking her nonsense in the guise of scholarship. He turned to the court. She claims the Wanderer star is a harmless light. We know it to be an omen of famine and war. She asks you to abandon the wisdom of ages and follow the scribbles of a girl who has spent too long in a dusty room. The laughter was loud and unrestrained now. Maeva stood frozen, her face pale. She had expected debate, argument, even dismissal. She had not expected this utter, personal demolition. Theron was not finished. He stepped forward and snatched the scrolls from her hands. She let out a small, involuntary cry of protest. These were her life's work. Years of sleepless nights, of painstaking observation, of quiet, lonely conviction. "This is not knowledge," Theron proclaimed, holding the scrolls aloft for all to see. "This is heresy." With a final theatrical flourish, he turned to a large, ornate brazier burning near the throne. He held the scrolls over the open flame. Maeva's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes pleaded silently with the king, but Alaric's face was an unreadable mask of iron. "Let us see how these celestial certainties fare against a terrestrial fire," Theron sneered, and he let them drop. The parchment curled, blackened, and then erupted into a burst of orange flame. Maeva watched, her heart turning to ash with them. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to the death of her dreams. The work of her soul was gone, erased by ignorance and fear. She had never felt so alone, so utterly and completely defeated. The scent of burning paper filled the great hall. Theron smiled, his victory complete. He turned back to the broken woman standing in the center of the room. "And now," the Arch-Chancellor's voice echoed, cold and final, "for the matter of the heretic herself." Theron's voice, slick with false mercy, filled the silent hall. He pointed a condemning finger at Maeva, whose spirit had already crumbled into dust alongside her research. For her heresy, a swift execution would be just, he announced, letting the threat hang in the air. "But our king is merciful. She will not be granted the dignity of a quick death. No, she will be sent to the kitchens. Let her spend her days scrubbing pots and floors, where her hands can do no more damage. Let her contemplate the virtues of silence and humility, which she so clearly lacks." A wave of cruel satisfaction rippled through the court. It was a perfect punishment, a sentence of living death, a daily reminder to anyone with ambition that a mind was a dangerous thing to have, especially if you were a woman. Two burly guards, their faces impassive, began to walk toward Maeva, her body tensed, her mind going numb. The kitchens, a life of grease and grime, of endless, mind-numbing labor, until she forgot she ever knew the names of the stars. It was over. But on the throne, something was shifting inside King Alaric. He had watched the entire spectacle, his rage a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He saw more than just a scholar being humbled. He saw a weapon being broken. He saw the same smug, intellectual superiority in Theron's eyes that he remembered from the men who had destroyed his father. With their clever words and forged documents, they had called his father weak for his love of books, and then used those very books to slit his throat. Now Theron, a relic of that same venomous court, was punishing this woman for the one thing that made her strong, her knowledge. Alaric didn't feel pity for Maeva. Pity was for the weak. What he felt was a flicker of profound, unsettling recognition. He saw a fighter, armed with a weapon he could never wield, being disarmed and discarded, and the warrior in him, the king in him, would not allow it. An asset was an asset, even if you did not understand how to use it. Just as the first guard reached out to grab Maeva's arm, a harsh, grating sound echoed through the hall. It was the sound of the king's heavy oak throne, scraping against the stone floor as he stood. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that it silenced everything. Every eye snapped to the king. King Alaric never rose unless he was leaving or passing judgment. He was a creature of stillness, of immense, coiled power. To see him stand now was like watching a mountain move. His face was hard, his eyes promising nothing but retribution. He did not look at Theron. He looked directly at the guards, who froze instantly, their hands hovering in the air. Then his gaze fell upon Maeva. His voice, when it came, was not the measured tone of a ruler in his court. It was the voice he used on the battlefield, a voice like rockfall and thunder, a voice that was not meant to be discussed, only obeyed. "She is no scullery maid." The words were simple, the declaration absolute. A stunned silence descended, so total that the crackling of the fire in the brazier sounded like a roar. Theron's face, which had been a mask of triumph, now twisted with confusion and fury. He opened his mouth to speak, but Alaric cut him off, his voice dropping lower, yet somehow carrying more weight. "She will serve in the royal scriptorium," the king commanded, cataloging old records. The shock in the room was a physical thing. It was an audible gasp from the lords and ladies. The scriptorium was a dusty, forgotten relic, but it was a place of honor, a place of knowledge. It was the exact opposite of the kitchens. It made no sense. It was a reprieve so illogical, it felt like a riddle. Maeva looked up, her tear-streaked face a canvas of disbelief. She stared at the king, trying to understand. There was no kindness in his expression, no hint of compassion. His face was a fortress, his eyes giving away nothing. He had not saved her. He had claimed her. The distinction was terrifying. The guards backed away as if she were suddenly surrounded by an invisible wall. Theron stood speechless, his face pale with rage. He had been publicly overruled, his authority cut out from under him with a few simple words, and he could do nothing. A royal steward, his face as confused as everyone else's, scurried forward and bowed low before Maeva. "This way, my lady," he stammered, the honorific slipping out, unsure of what else to call her. In that moment, a king known only for his silence had spoken a sentence that would alter the course of 2 lives. His reasons were his own, locked away behind a wall of unspoken pain. If you believe that a single act of defiance can spark a revolution of the heart, share this story so that more people can witness what grows from this mysterious act of protection. As the steward gently guided her away from the center of the hall, Maeva cast one last bewildered glance at the throne. King Alaric had already seated himself, his expression once again unreadable, as if he had done nothing at all. He had thrown her a lifeline, but as she was led down a long, quiet corridor toward her new life, she could not tell if the other end was anchored to a harbor or to a far more dangerous shore. The journey to the scriptorium was a journey into the castle's forgotten past. The steward led Maeva away from the main halls with their roaring fires and boisterous guards, and down a series of narrow, winding corridors. The air grew cooler here, the stone walls damp to the touch. The tapestries grew faded, their heroic scenes obscured by dust and time. It felt as if she were walking backwards through history, leaving the loud, brutal present for the quiet of a bygone era. They arrived at a heavy, iron-banded oak door at the end of a deserted hallway. The steward produced a large, rusty key, and with a groan of protest, the lock turned. He pushed the door open, revealing not a room, but a cavern of darkness that smelled of dust, decaying paper, and a profound, undisturbed silence. He handed her a single candle. "Your meals will be brought twice a day," he said, his voice hushed, as if he were in a tomb. "The king's orders are that you are not to be disturbed, and you are not to leave." He did not wait for a reply. He backed away, pulling the great door closed. The sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place echoed in the darkness, a sound of absolute finality. And then there was only silence. Maeva stood frozen just inside the doorway, the candlelight flickering in her trembling hand. As her eyes adjusted, the sheer scale of the room revealed itself. It was a vast circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves that soared upwards into a gloom her small flame could not penetrate. It was a forest of books, a necropolis of forgotten knowledge, Scrolls were piled in chaotic mounds. Leather-bound volumes lay splayed open on dusty tables, their pages warped by years of neglect. For any other person, it would have been a prison, a dusty, lightless cage. But for Maeva, it was a cathedral. The fear was still. There, a cold, sharp stone in her gut. The king's action was a riddle without an answer. Why this? What did he expect from her? Was this some crueler, more elaborate form of punishment, to be left to rot amidst the very things she loved? The question swirled in her mind, a frantic, desperate buzz. But as the minutes stretched on, another feeling began to surface, pushing back against the fear. It was a feeling of immense, soul-deep relief. The silence was not empty. It was a sanctuary. It was a thick woolen blanket wrapped around her spirit, which had been flayed raw by the court's mockery. Here there were no whispers, no cruel laughter, no one to watch her with contempt. Slowly she took a step forward, then another. She ran her fingers along the spine of a massive, leather-bound book, the touch sending a shiver through her. She lifted her candle to a shelf and read the faded titles, her lips moving silently. Her stars. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. He had burned her work, but he had given her this. She sank to the floor, right there in the dust and the dark, and for the first time since she had entered the great hall, she allowed herself to weep. She cried for her lost scrolls, for her humiliation, for her terror. But she also cried with a strange, burgeoning sense of gratitude for this silent, dusty harbor. Days bled into one another. A silent guard would leave a tray of simple food by the door and take the old one. It was her only contact with the outside world. She learned from him that King Alaric never came here. The scriptorium had been his father's domain, and since the old king's death, Alaric had sealed it in his memory, just as he had sealed it in fact. This only deepened the mystery. Why would he send her to the one place in the castle he could not bear to enter himself? She pushed the question from her mind. To dwell on it was to invite madness. Instead, she focused on the king's command, cataloging old records. It was an impossible task, a task for a dozen scribes over a dozen lifetimes, but it was a purpose. She started in one corner with a section that seemed to be dedicated to history. The books were in no order. She began the painstaking process of sorting them, her movements slow and methodical. The work was a balm. It was a prayer. It was a way to rebuild herself, one dusty book at a time. One evening, exhausted from her work, she found herself staring up at a high shelf. There, tucked away behind a row of common histories, she saw the corner of a dark blue binding, a color and style she recognized from a famous observatory in the south. It was a book on astronomy. Her heart leapt. She dragged over a rickety stool, but it was no use. The book was far too high, well beyond her reach. Defeated, she sighed, promising herself she would find a way to retrieve it another day. She ate her meager meal of bread and cheese, blew out her candle, and curled up under a threadbare blanket she had found. As she drifted into a fitful sleep, she was unaware of a presence high above. In the deep shadows of a vaulted gallery that ringed the top of the scriptorium, a figure stood motionless. He had watched her work, had seen her struggle with the stool, had seen the flicker of longing and frustration in her eyes as she looked at the book on the high shelf. King Alaric stood there for a long time, a silent guardian in the darkness, before turning and melting back into the shadows from which he came. When Maeva awoke the next morning, the first thing she saw stopped her breath. Standing exactly where she had struggled the night before was a stepladder. It was not an old, forgotten item from the castle stores. It was new. The pale oak was freshly cut, its scent clean and sharp in the musty air. The craftsmanship was simple, sturdy, and perfect. There were no carvings, no embellishments, just the plain, honest work of a carpenter who valued function over form. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a feeling far colder than the morning chill. She slowly rose and walked towards it, running a hand over the smooth wood. There was only one person who could have ordered this. Her gaze lifted to the high, shadowy galleries that ringed the room. She was not alone here. She was being watched. The thought should have terrified her, and a part of her was deeply unsettled. But the fear was tangled with something else, something warm and bewildering. Her struggle had been seen, and the silent observer had not responded with mockery or indifference, but with a solution, a quiet, practical act of care. Holding her breath, she climbed the steady steps of the ladder. Her fingers closed around the dark blue binding of the astronomy book. She pulled it from the shelf, holding it to her chest like a priceless treasure. It was a small victory, but it felt immense. A gift from her invisible guardian. Weeks passed, and a strange rhythm established itself in the warm scriptorium. Maeva worked tirelessly, bringing a semblance of order to the chaos of books. Then, one morning, she found something new beside her breakfast tray, a stack of scrolls tied with the crimson ribbon of the King's Royal Council. Her blood ran cold. She backed away from them as if they were venomous snakes. These were matters of state. Was this a trap? A test from Theron, arranged to finally prove her a traitor? For an entire day she refused to touch them, her anxiety a frantic knot in her stomach. The next morning another scroll had been added to the pile. Beside it lay a small, flat clay tablet. Scratched into its surface was a crude, almost childish drawing of a river that forked around a dense patch of trees. She recognized it instantly as the disputed lands near the northern border. The scroll it lay beside was the dense, unreadable logging treaty that the council had been debating for months. In a flash of insight she understood. He was a king besieged by words, by clauses and subclauses designed to confuse and deceive. He was surrounded by men who could read, but he trusted none of them. This was not a test. It was a desperate, silent plea for help. Taking a tremendous leap of faith, Maeva spent the entire day poring over the treaty. She translated its convoluted language into simple, direct points, summarizing the benefits and risks in a few clear paragraphs. With a trembling hand, she left her summary beside the original scrolls. The next morning, they were gone. In their place was a new, larger stack of documents. Their dialogue had begun. This secret work became the center of her existence. She was the king's eyes, his interpreter of the treacherous world of words. As she worked, however, her cheap supplies began to fail her. Her last quill frayed, and the watery ink bled across the parchment, blurring her careful script. She worked late into the night, her frustration mounting as she tried to make her letters clean and sharp. Alaric, in his private chambers, held her latest summary. He saw the brilliant clarity of her thoughts, the way she cut through the fog of legal language to reveal the simple truth of a matter, and he also saw the faint, blotchy letters, the evidence of her struggle. He saw her dedication reflected in the flawed script. The following day, a small, polished wooden box sat on her desk. It was not marked with the royal seal, but she knew its origin. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, were 3 perfectly sharpened raven feather quills, a pot of ink as black and deep as a starless night, and a sheaf of parchment so smooth it felt like silk beneath her fingers. It was not a gift of charity. It was a gift of respect. It was an acknowledgment of her craft, of her value. A warm, unfamiliar emotion bloomed in Maeva's chest, and she had to sit down before her legs gave way. As autumn bled into winter, the great stone room grew relentlessly cold. A damp chill seeped into Maeva's bones, and she spent her days huddled in a thin blanket, her fingers growing numb and stiff. The cold was a constant, aching misery. One morning she awoke not to the biting chill, but to a gentle, radiating warmth. In the corner, a heavy iron brazier glowed with red-hot coals chasing the dampness from the air. And draped carefully over the back of her chair was a thick, heavy woolen cloak. It was dark green, the color of the king's elite guard, simple and unadorned. She stood up and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled faintly of wood smoke, horses, and leather, the scent of the world outside, the scent of the king himself. It was more than a cloak. It was a shield. It felt like an embrace. Their silent partnership was now the secret heart of the kingdom. Every night the problems of the realm were left at her door. Every morning the solutions were taken away. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the king's voice, his scribe, his most trusted and secret counselor. The fear she had once felt had been replaced by a deep and profound curiosity. The king, Alaric, now governed with a new, startling wisdom, his decisions swift and surgically precise. He trusted the clear, honest words of the woman in his forgotten library more than any man in his court. He was relying on her completely. But what wound was so deep that it had walled off the world of words from him? And what magic did this woman possess that she, and she alone, had found the key to the gate? In the solitude of his chambers late at night, King Alaric would read Maeva's summaries. His finger, thick and calloused from a lifetime of holding a sword, would trace the clean, sharp lines of her script. He did not read with ease. Each word was an effort, a challenge he forced himself to meet. But the meaning was always clear, the truth of the matter laid bare. Her words were a lantern in the dense, suffocating fog of his rule. This growing light was a balm on an old and poisoned wound, a wound inflicted years ago in a court that valued words above all else. To understand the king's profound, almost desperate trust in the woman in his library, one must first understand the betrayal that had taught him to hate the written word. The great hall of his father, King Theronius, was not a place of steel and shadow. It was bright, filled with scholars and poets. Debates on philosophy would echo for hours, and the highest currency was not strength, but wit. King Theronius was a gentleman with ink-stained fingers and a kind, weary smile. He loved books more than he loved power, and he saw the world as a text to be understood, not a field to be conquered. His son, a young and fiery Alaric, was a stranger in this court. He was built for the training yard, not the debating circle. His father would often sigh, placing a hand on his son's broad shoulder. A king's mind is his greatest weapon, my boy. Theronius would say gently, a sword is just a piece of steel. Alaric loved his father, but he saw what the old king in his wisdom refused to see. He saw the ambitious lords circling like jackals. He saw the silver-tongued advisers whispering poison in his father's ear. And at the center of them all was a younger, sharper Arch-Chancellor Theron, a man whose loyalty was a carefully constructed fiction. The betrayal, when it came, was not a clash of swords, but the scratch of a quill on parchment. The conspirators, with Theron as their architect, presented the king with a peace treaty from a rival kingdom. It was a masterpiece of deception, a long, convoluted document filled with clauses of friendship and flowery promises of mutual respect. King Theronius, eager for peace, spent a day reading it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He saw no harm in it. He saw only a chance to end a pointless conflict. In the presence of his council, he signed his name. Alaric was there. He watched his father dip the royal quill in ink, and he felt a cold dread he could not explain. He could not read the document. To him, it was just a page of meaningless, elegant symbols, no different from any other. Days later, the trap was sprung. Theron presented the signed treaty to the kingdom's military commanders. But he did not read the parts about friendship. He read the hidden clauses, the ones that his father's trusting eyes had skimmed over, clauses that ceded control of two critical border fortresses, clauses that pledged Theronius's armies to fight alongside their rivals in a different war. The document did not secure peace. It sold the kingdom. It was an act of high treason. The commanders were furious. The gentle, book-loving king had betrayed them all. Alaric stood beside his father as he was condemned. He saw the horror and disbelief dawn on his father's face as he finally understood the treachery. The old king tried to protest, to explain, but his words were drowned out by shouts of "Traitor!" Alaric, the warrior prince, could do nothing. He could have fought a dozen armed men, but he could not fight a lie written on a piece of paper. He was disarmed by his own ignorance. That was the day his hatred was forged. A hatred for the slick, sophisticated cruelty of the written word, a weapon that could kill a king without shedding a single drop of blood. His father was imprisoned and died within the month of what Theron called a profound and sudden grief. Alaric was forced into exile, a prince with nothing but his sword, and a burning vow to one day reclaim his throne, not with clever words, but with the simple, undeniable truth of steel. Back in the present, Alaric stared at Maeva's clear handwriting. For 15 years, every document he was handed looked like that monstrous treaty. Every advisor who spoke in long, elegant sentences sounded like Theron. He had built a fortress of silence around himself, trusting only his own eyes and his own sword. But Maeva was different. Her words did not confuse or conceal. They clarified. They illuminated. She was using the weapon that had destroyed his family, not for deceit, but for truth. With every summary she wrote, she was unknowingly rebuilding his shattered trust. She was cleaning the poison from the wound. In the quiet solitude of his library, he was beginning to feel something he had not felt since he was a boy, a sense of peace. But peace is a fragile thing. In his own offices, Arch-Chancellor Theron was not at peace. The king was changing. His recent edicts were shrewd, his grasp of trade and law unnervingly precise. This was not the work of the blunt warrior king he had manipulated for years. His spies brought him whispers, the endless scrolls being sent to the scriptorium, the fine quills and expensive parchment delivered to the disgraced scholar. Theron's face darkened with suspicion and a familiar venomous jealousy. He had silenced Maeva's voice in the great hall, but it seemed she had found a way to speak directly into the king's ear. A new plan, far crueler and more personal than the first, began to form in his mind. If he could not silence her, he would destroy the very foundation of her alliance with the king. He would target their fragile, unspoken trust and burn it to the ground. The fragile peace that had settled over the castle was not destined to last. While Maeva brought order to the scriptorium and Alaric governed with newfound clarity, the architect of their humiliation was watching. Arch-Chancellor Theron, the snake pit of his own ambition, could feel his influence over the king withering day by day. In his opulent private study, he examined a page of Maeva's work, obtained by a well-paid servant. He saw her clear, precise script, the elegant way she distilled complex problems into simple truths. He felt a grudging respect for her mind, a respect that was immediately curdled by a hot, possessive fury. She had succeeded where he had failed. She had earned the king's trust. He realized then that he could not outmaneuver her. As long as she was the king's secret voice, his own power would continue to fade. Therefore, she had to be utterly and permanently destroyed. And he knew exactly how to do it. He would not simply accuse her. He would make the king himself believe she was the serpent. He would use the past as a weapon, reopening Alaric's oldest wound and pouring salt into it. Days later, in a damp, torchlit chamber deep beneath the castle, Theron met with a man whose face was lost to shadow. The man was a master forger, an artist of deceit. Theron handed him the stolen page of Maeva's writing. "I need a letter," the chancellor hissed, his voice a low whisper. "In this exact hand, a letter from the scribe to King Olin of the Western Isles. I want her to be offering him secrets, details of our troop movements, our grain stores. I want her to mock our king, call him a brute, an ignorant warrior, easily led." He smiled, a chilling sight in the flickering light. "I want it to break his heart." The forger took the page, his eyes gleaming. He promised a masterpiece. A week later, Theron called an urgent meeting of the Royal Council. It was a small, powerful group that met in the king's private chambers. As they discussed tax levies, Theron interrupted, his face a mask of grave sorrow. "My king, forgive this interruption," he began, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion, "but a matter of the most urgent and painful nature has come to my attention." He produced A single sheet of parchment sealed with a broken, unfamiliar sigil. My agents intercepted this letter on its way to the coast. We believe it was destined for our enemy, King Olin. Alaric's eyes narrowed. He motioned for Theron to continue. "My king," Theron said, his voice dropping. "The letter. It is penned in a hand we have recently come to value." He unfurled the parchment. There for all to see was Maeva's unmistakable, elegant script. Theron began to read aloud. The words were a cascade of venom and betrayal. The letter detailed weaknesses in the castle's defenses, spoke of the king's schedule, and offered a wealth of strategic information. Then came the personal blows. "The warrior king is a creature of habit," Theron read, his voice filled with false pity. "He is strong of arm but weak of mind, a simple man who cannot see the puppet strings, as long as his ego is fed. A few simple words, a show of loyalty, and he follows like a tamed hound." The air in the room grew thick and cold. The council members stared, horrified, at their king. Alaric's face had gone pale, his expression turning to stone. The room dissolves. He is no longer a king in his council chamber. He is a boy again, watching his father's world crumble. The letter in Theron's hand is the same one from all those years ago. The words are the same lies, the same sophisticated poison. Maeva's face, which he had come to associate with clarity and truth, now merged with the faces of the traitors who had destroyed his family. The fragile trust he had built over months was shattering like glass. The fortress around his heart, which had just begun to open, was slamming shut. A king's heart, a kingdom's fate, and a woman's life all hung upon that single piece of parchment. It was a perfect echo of the past, a trap designed to ensnare a wounded soul. If you believe that trust, once earned, can become a shield against even the most wicked lies, subscribe to our channel to see if Alaric will break the cycle that destroyed his father. "She is a viper we have warmed at our own hearth," Theron concluded, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He held the letter out to the king. "Your orders, my king? She must be seized. She must be executed for this treason." The council held its breath, waiting for the explosion of royal rage they all expected. They waited for the roar, for the command to drag Maeva to the dungeons in chains. But it did not come. For a long moment Alaric did not move. He simply stared at the letter, his face a mask of anguish. Then something shifted. The hurt in his eyes was replaced by a cold, terrifying calm. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate. He did not speak. He did not look at Theron or any member of his council. He walked forward, plucked the forged letter from the chancellor's hand, and turned. With long, purposeful strides that echoed in the stunned silence, he walked out of the council chamber, the damning letter clutched in his fist. He left behind a room of terrified, confused men and an arch-chancellor whose perfect trap had just yielded a completely unknown and terrifying result. Maeva was lost in her work, carefully transcribing a faded map, when the great door of the scriptorium burst open, crashing against the stone wall. She leapt to her feet, her heart seizing in her chest. It was the king. He stood framed in the doorway, not as a silent observer, but as a storm cloud given human form. His face was a terrible mask of fury and pain, and in his hand he clutched a piece of parchment like a weapon. He strode towards her, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones. The air crackled with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. She thought of the stories of his rages on the battlefield, of men cut down for a moment's hesitation. She was certain he had come to kill her. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat of his anger. He thrust the crumpled letter at her. His voice was a low, ragged thing, torn from the depths of his soul. "Did you write this?" It was the first direct question he had ever asked her, and it was an accusation that carried the weight of a death sentence. Her hand trembled as she took the letter. She flattened it on the desk and read. The color drained from her face. She saw the lies, the treason, the cruel, mocking words about the king she had come to secretly serve and respect. A wave of nausea washed over her. She looked up, her eyes wide with a desperate, horrified sincerity. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, finding a hidden reserve of strength, she said it again, louder and clearer. "No, my king, I did not write this. I swear it on my life." Alaric stared down at her, his mind a warring tempest. He wanted to believe her. Every part of his being that had begun to heal under her quiet influence screamed that she was telling the truth. But the letter was a perfect imitation. The ghost of his father whispered in his ear, warning him, reminding him how easily a man can be fooled by a beautiful lie. Seeing the doubt still raging in his eyes, Maeva's fear sharpened into focus. She would not be his father. She would not let a lie on a piece of paper destroy them. Her mind, her greatest asset, took control. "I can prove it," she said, her voice steady now, infused with the authority of her knowledge. He did not speak, but his eyes narrowed, giving her leave. "Look here," she said, pointing a steady finger at the parchment. "The letter T. The forger has crossed it with a perfectly straight line, but my hand is not so disciplined. I cross my T with a slight upward curve at the end. Always." She quickly found one of her own summaries and laid it beside the forgery. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. "And the ink," she continued, her confidence growing. "This is iron gall ink, which is common, but to prevent it from fading, I add a small amount of pomegranate rind to my personal mixture. It gives it a slightly warmer tone in the light. This ink is cold, flat. It is the exact mixture the Arch-Chancellor favors for his official correspondence." Finally, she held the letter up to the candlelight. "And this, the parchment itself. See this small watermark of a swan? This is from a new batch delivered from the mills last week. I have not used it. All of my work for you, my king, has been on the older stock, the one with the lion watermark." She laid out the evidence, piece by irrefutable piece. She was not begging or pleading, she was teaching. She was using her knowledge not to trick or impress, but to reveal the absolute, unvarnished truth. As Alaric listened, he felt the storm inside him begin to calm. The ghosts of the past receded. He saw not a traitor, but a brilliant scholar dissecting a lie with the precision of a master surgeon. She had armed him. She had given him the one thing he never had during his father's downfall. Proof. Anew. Fire was kindled within him. Not the hot, blind rage of a wounded man, but the cold, focused fury of a king who had been played for a fool. He looked at Maeva, and for the first time he saw not a scribe, not an asset, but an ally, his true right hand. "Show them," he said, his voice now like solid iron. "Show them all." He turned and strode from the scriptorium, and Maeva, clutching her evidence, walked behind him. When they entered the royal council chamber together, a collective gasp went through the room. Theron, who had been smugly accepting the council's condolences, froze, his face turning the color of ash. Alaric took his place, not at the head of the table, but standing beside Maeva, a silent, unmovable declaration of his support. "The scribe has something to say," he announced. With the king as her shield, Maeva's voice did not tremble. She addressed the council with calm, intellectual authority. She laid out her proof, piece by piece, her words clear and sharp as glass. She had the steward bring in Theron's inkwell for comparison. She showed them the watermarks. She deconstructed the forgery so completely, so logically, that it left no room for doubt. She dismantled Theron's plot with the very intelligence he had sought to punish. When she finished, the room was utterly silent. Theron sputtered, his face slick with sweat, calling it a trick, a witch's lies. Alaric finally turned his gaze upon him, and Theron flinched, as if struck. The king's voice was quiet, yet it carried the deadly finality of a headsman's axe. "You sought to use my father's memory as a knife to wound me," he said, each word a drop of poison. "You used this woman's honor as a trap to control me. This court has suffered your presence long enough." He looked to the guards at the door. "Seize him!" As the guards dragged the screaming, protesting chancellor from the room, Alaric's eyes met Maeva's across the chamber. No words were needed. The unspoken questions, the fear, the doubt, it had all been burned away. In its place was a bond of trust, forged in the fires of a shared battle and a shared victory. Their alliance was no longer a secret whispered in a dusty room. It was now the unshakable foundation of the throne. The castle fell into a stunned, watchful quiet in the wake of Theron's arrest. The serpent had been cut from the heart of the court, and in the strange calm that followed, a new sense of order began to settle over the kingdom. That night, Maeva returned to the scriptorium. The heavy door, which had once seemed like the gate to a prison, now felt like the entrance to her home. The familiar scent of old paper and beeswax was no longer the smell of confinement, but of safety and purpose. She lit a single candle, the small flame pushing back the vast darkness, and looked around at the towering shelves of books. They were not just objects to be catalogued. They were her allies, her friends, the silent witnesses to her transformation. She was running a hand over a newly organized shelf of histories. When the door opened again, it did not crash open this time. It swung inward with a soft, quiet push. Alaric stood on the threshold, not as a king radiating power, but simply as a man. The weight of his crown and the armor around his heart seemed to have been set aside, leaving him looking weary, humbled, and finally at peace. Her heart did not leap with fear. Instead, a slow, steady warmth spread through her chest. He was no longer her jailer or her mysterious protector. He was her partner. He walked into the room, his footsteps soft on the stone floor. He did not speak, and neither did she. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of the unknown, but a comfortable, shared space. It was the quiet of two people who had faced a storm together and found shelter in one another. He walked past her to one of the tables where she had stacked her completed summaries, the piles neat and orderly. He ran his hand over the top. Scroll, a silent acknowledgment of their secret work, the foundation of their victory. His gaze drifted around the room, taking in the changes she had wrought, the pockets of order in the overwhelming chaos, the clean tables, the carefully sorted sections. He saw not just a cataloger's work, but the evidence of a mind that created clarity and light wherever it went. His eyes came to rest on a small, unassuming book lying on a low shelf. It was a children's primer, a simple thing of wood and cheap parchment bound with a leather cord. Its cover was worn, handled by generations of royal children long since grown. Maeva had found it during her sorting and had set it aside, touched by its simplicity. Alaric walked toward it. For his entire adult life, symbols like the ones in that book were his enemies. They were the sigils of his shame, the language of the trap that had killed his father. They represented everything he was not, learned, sophisticated, and vulnerable to a certain kind of poison. But now, in the quiet safety of this room, with the woman who had turned that poison into an antidote, the book looked different. It no longer looked like a weapon pointed at him. It looked like a key. His large, scarred hand, a hand made to grip the hilt of a broadsword, reached out and gently picked up the small book. It looked fragile and almost comical in his powerful grasp. He turned the book held carefully in his palms and faced Maeva. He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that he had never shown to another living soul. The walls of his fortress were gone, dismantled brick by their silent dialogue of care. All that was left was the man inside, a man who had been isolated by his own pain for far too long. He took a step toward her and held the book out, not as an offering, but as a plea. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, thick with the weight of a confession he had held back for a lifetime. "Teach me." Two simple words, but in them Maeva heard everything. It was not a king's command. It was a husband's request. It was an admission of his deepest insecurity, a surrender of his most guarded secret. He was not just asking her to teach him how to read the letters on a page. He was asking her to teach him how to read the world in a new way. He was giving her the final, most protected piece of himself. He was trusting her with his soul. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the candlelight. They were not tears of sorrow or pity, but of overwhelming joy, and a love so profound it needed no other name. She did not speak. Words were unnecessary. She simply gave him a small, radiant nod. Taking the primer from him, she led him to the simple wooden table where she worked. They sat down beside each other, their shoulders almost touching. The king, who commanded legions, and the scholar, who had been condemned for her knowledge, were now just a man and a woman. She opened the book to the very first page. It was a large, crudely drawn picture of an apple, and beside it the first letter of the alphabet. A bold, simple A. Alaric leaned forward, his brow furrowed in a concentration more intense than any he had ever shown on a battlefield. He looked at the letter, as if for the first time, not as an enemy, but as a doorway. As he stared at the symbol, Maeva gently reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the table. It was a simple gesture of solidarity, a silent promise, and in the quiet candlelight of the ancient library, they began. Years passed, the seasons turned, and the reign of King Alaric and Queen Maeva became a quiet legend in the kingdom's history. It was not an age marked by grand conquests or bloody wars, but by something far more rare and revolutionary, a time of steady, quiet, and profound peace. The royal scriptorium, once a dusty, forgotten tomb, was utterly transformed. Great arched windows had been carved into its stone walls, flooding the chamber with warm, golden sunlight. The towering shelves were no longer chaotic and neglected, but meticulously organized and cared for. The air no longer smelled of decay, but of polished wood, fresh ink, and the clean scent of new ideas. It was no longer called the scriptorium. It was now the great royal library, its doors open, not just to lords and ladies, but to the sons and daughters of merchants, blacksmiths, and farmers. It had become the beating heart of an enlightened kingdom. Wabita, sun-drenched alcove near a window overlooking the castle gardens, sat the king and queen. Time had softened the hard edges of Alaric's face, replacing the constant tension with lines of contentment. He no longer looked like a warrior guarding a fortress, but like a man at peace in his own home. Maeva sat beside him, her quiet dignity now radiating a serene confidence. The years had only deepened the love and respect that shone in her eyes when she looked at him. They were sharing a heavy book of maps, their heads close together as he traced a proposed trade route with his finger. He looked at her, raising an eyebrow in a silent question. She smiled and nodded, tapping a different point on the map. It was a negotiation without words, a seamless partnership that now governed the realm. Their comfortable silence was the language of two souls who knew each other completely. The peaceful moment was broken by the sound of small running feet. A boy of about 5 years with his mother's bright, intelligent eyes and his father's sturdy frame came racing towards them, clutching a colorful storybook to his chest. He scrambled onto the bench beside Alaric, paying no mind to the royal maps, his own mission far more urgent. "Father," the little prince said, his voice full of childish importance as he held up his book, "read this one. It's the one about the dragon who couldn't fly." Alaric looked down at his son, and a warm, easy smile spread across his face. This was the man who had once flinched at the sight of a written word, who saw every book as a potential trap. Now he looked at the one his son offered with nothing but gentle affection. He closed the heavy book of maps, his duty as a king momentarily set aside for his more important role as a father. He lifted the boy onto his lap, the child settling in with the easy confidence of one who has never known anything but love and safety. Alaric opened the little book. His voice, once used only for commands on the battlefield, was now calm and gentle, filled with the warmth of a summer afternoon. The little dragon, whose name was Flicker, the king read slowly and clearly, sat at the edge of the cliff. All his brothers and sisters soared on the wind, their scales glittering like jewels in the sun, but Flicker's wings felt heavy, and his heart was full of fear. Maeva watched them, her hand resting on Alaric's shoulder. She saw not a king, but her husband. She saw not a prince, but their son. And she saw the beautiful, perfect closing of a circle. The shame that had haunted a generation had been transformed into a bedtime story. The wound had not just healed, it had become a source of strength and tenderness. And a scholar's greatest victory was not in proving her own brilliance, but in teaching a broken heart that it was safe to trust again. Their love story became a quiet lesson for their entire kingdom. If this journey of two souls finding light in the darkness has touched you, subscribe to our channel because it is a testament that the most powerful legacies are not written in stone, but in the pages of a life built on courage and love. The final image is of the three of them, bathed in the warm library light. The king, the queen, and their son. A family, a future. A testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest act of a king is not to conquer the world, but to simply learn how to read a story to his child.